Welcome back. Now, tomorrow, the Chancellor will report his spring statement in the House of Commons, where he's come under intense pressure to tackle soaring living costs facing UK households. Prices are rising at the fastest pace in 3 decades, and wages have not kept up with that pace, adding to an intensifying squeeze on households. Speculation has grown recently over what could be announced, with reports of an increase in national insurance thresholds, lowering the pain for those on lowest incomes, and potentially a 5p cut in fuel duty. Well, what are the prospects of these potential changes? With me now is Conservative MP for Weston-super-Mare John Penrose. Welcome to the programme, John. I suppose, first of all, in this discussion, we need to look at what Rishi Sunak is facing. It's not just Britain that's facing record inflation, but the whole of the Western world. The fundamentals of this spring statement, the fundamentals that it is facing up to, are pretty bleak.
Absolutely right, Tom. And you're absolutely right to point out that it is an international problem. It was already quite tricky because post-pandemic, all sorts of weird things were happening to international supply lines, all sorts of things that have to be shipped in from China in normal times, shipped through in the wrong places. There were shortages of raw materials, all sorts of things had needed to be upgraded and invested in. And then on top of that, of course, we've got the conflict in Ukraine. That's had a huge impact on particularly energy prices, but other things as well. And so, nobody, Rishi Sunak or anybody else, his opposite numbers in other countries, can act like King Canute and sort of hold back the tide. That doesn't work. And so he's got a very, very difficult backdrop against which to deliver this long expected statement.
There have been a number of out there suggestions and some more middle-of-the-road suggestions. Some think tanks saying that the Chancellor should simply give people free cash. Others suggesting that rate threshold rises would be a better solution. In your view, do you think that the Chancellor will be more conservative with a small c, if I can use that phrase, or could there be some sort of large rabbit to be expected tomorrow?
Well, I think he's going to have he's caught between a rock and a hard place effectively, because he has, if he's a proper conservative, and he is, he's going to want to make sure that we aren't running up the nation's credit card, that we are following sound money principles and not spending money we haven't got. So he can't just borrow willy-nilly, and particularly because we had to borrow an enormous amount because of the pandemic. You can't carry on doing that indefinitely. So he's going to want to make sure that he isn't spending money that it doesn't exist. But he also knows that if he doesn't do something to cope with the rising cost of living, and that will involve trying to get more money back into people's pockets, then actually that's also very bad for the economy, because you end up with falling demand and everybody sort of struggling to make ends meet. So it's a very, very difficult situation. My guess is that what he will do is try and stick to sound money mostly. But he's got a little bit of extra money coming in because those rising prices means that VAT receipts will have gone up. He'll be getting more money in because VAT is a percentage of those rising prices. So he's getting a bit more money in than he thought. That might give him a little bit of extra cash to do something on, for example, fuel duty, or you mentioned national insurance thresholds, something like that, in order to help a bit in the short term. But ultimately, the long-term answer has to be to do reforms to things like the energy market, so that the cost of that energy has to fall over time as we bring in more renewables, which are where the price is falling rather than rising. That's the long-term answer, and anything he does will only be a short-term measure.
Now, the UK experienced some pretty impressive growth last year, the fastest growth in the G7. Although the projections for growth now over the course of this year and next year are reducing pretty quickly. It becomes pretty anemic in pretty short order. Do you think this government is prioritising growth enough, or is it just resting on the laurels that last year was pretty good?
I think that, again, this is your point to start off with about this being an international crisis. If you ram up prices, or if prices go up, not because of anything that we've done in this country, but because of those international trends that we were just talking about just now, that has a really bad effect on growth. Rather understandably, it sucks money out of the economy. And that means that growth naturally will slow. And one of the things that he's got to try and fight against is to find ways to do those fundamental underlying reforms I was just talking about, to keep growth going in spite of rapidly rising, spiraling energy costs. That's a really difficult trick to pull off without trying to sort of borrow your way out of trouble, which again, you can't spend money you don't have, or you can't do that for very long, put it that way.
Certainly not. I mean, looking at some of the challenges that the Chancellor faces, indeed, as we've rightly been saying, that the Western world faces, how much of the inflation issue do you believe came from the easy money that we saw over the course of the pandemic? All of the stimulus effects that the government did, pumping money into the economy, that surely has had an effect in increasing the money supply and raising prices.
It will certainly have had an effect. I suspect also, though, that the other factors are at least as big, if not much bigger, potentially. And those are the effects on the supply chains I was talking about before, all these things that normally come to us from places like China, and also this enormous, great big price shock coming from the price of energy. And if you think about it, energy is one of the things that underpins an awful lot of everything that we buy. There's energy in that supply chain somewhere, so it has a knock-on effect to almost everything. The point is that quite a lot of things we were buying less of during the pandemic because we were all in lockdown and those sorts of things. And therefore, the capacity, the factories that were making whatever it is we were buying, sort of scaled back. They didn't have to work as fast, they didn't have to work as hard, and they scaled back. Now, as things get back to normal, demand's going back up to normal levels. The factories aren't tooled up, and that's one of the things that is fundamentally driving all this inflation. So it may be, you're right, that some of the things that happened during the pandemic with easy money made a difference, but all these other factors are at least as big, and probably in many cases, in many sectors, bigger still.
I wonder, looking at the basics of tax and spend, I listened closely to what the Chancellor said in Blackpool on Friday when he had not quite a speech, but an interview with another MP. And he seemed to be suggesting that he had to raise taxes early now to deal with this deficit, and he wants to be very hawkish when it comes to the deficit, or at least as hawkish as he can be. But then he wants to cut taxes later on in the Parliament. Does that make any kind of economic sense, to raise taxes first in order to cut them later? Surely, if you want to spur growth, you cut the taxes first, you don't raise them.
Well, there's two factors going on. I mean, one is the grubby but absolutely unavoidable factor of politics and electoral cycles. So you really don't want, if you have any ambition at all to get re-elected, to be raising taxes near a general election. But also there is economic sense behind it too. And the reason why is because we have the most enormous backlog of NHS patients waiting for all sorts of non-COVID treatments, things like hip operations, knee replacements, cataract operations, things like that. Some of these people have been waiting for a year or two now, far longer than they should or normally would have to. So we can't just ignore all of them. We have to do something about trying to deal with that as well. But you're right that when Rishi originally announced his plans to, for example, try and pay for all these extra operations and all these other things, he didn't know, because none of us knew at the time, that there was going to be this enormous, great big spike in energy prices. So one of the difficult judgments that he's got to make is, does he stick to his plans, or does he try and delay some of them and try and make sure that you aren't sort of sucking more money out of the economy by a rise in national insurance contributions in order to sort of allow the economy to try and struggle through this and absorb the effects of this enormous, great big energy price rise. Not an easy decision, and one of those things where nobody actually knows the right answer at this stage. At the end of the day, he's going to have to make a decision based on really incomplete information. And the temptation, of course, will be to stick to plan A because that's what everyone's expecting, and it's what is sort of baked in.
It's not an enviable position to be standing at that dispatch box tomorrow at around 12:30 following PMQs, but we will be watching it with close intent. John Penrose, for now, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing to talk through those issues this afternoon.